One of the things that I love about Solel is that there are so many different ways to get involved, to learn, and to grow. Solel really has something to offer just about anyone. But for me personally, one of the most important things that we do as a Jewish community is the rabbi's adult Torah study. I know, it's very exciting. I've been studying Torah every Sunday morning at Beit Sefer Solel with our rabbi and the people who have become a big part of my Solel family since 2001. Of course, there are many, many other things that we do which touch the lives of more people. There are many things which are more important in the grand scheme of things, as far as providing a welcoming home for Jews in the Western GTA. But the thing that really recharges my spiritual batteries, so to speak, is learning Torah with a group of people who are interested in digging more deeply into what God and our tradition have to tell us about living Jewishly in the modern world. I bring this up not by way of a commercial, well, not just by way of a commercial. We meet every Sunday at 9:30 at Beit Sefer, but rather because a really interesting thing came up in our Torah study a couple of weeks ago, and I think it ties in very closely with this week's Torah portion. In the Torah study, we've been talking about mitzvot, the laws of Torah. What are they? Where do they come from? What do they mean for us as Reformed Jews? And how do we make sense of them in our modern daily lives? When you start talking about the mitzvot, the laws, it's easy to find yourself talking about halakha, the rules and regulations. And a couple of weeks ago, we found ourselves in the trap of measuring our Jewishness by a standard set by others, specifically the Orthodox or even the Chayyei, the ultra-Orthodox. During our discussion, Rabbi Pollack made a very interesting and I think a very important point. She said that as Reformed Jews, we need to avoid measuring ourselves against the standards of people whose ideas of Judaism aren't the same as, or perhaps even compatible with our own. It might be easy to forget this living in a place like Toronto, where Reform is the minority, but in most places, and certainly within North America, liberal Judaism, and particularly Reform Judaism, is by far the majority. And I think you can even make a credible case for the claim that even in the land of Israel, most Jews are really Reform Jews. They might think of themselves as secular, but the Orthodox have controlled the definition of Jewishness in Israel so tightly and for so long that anyone who knows that they aren't anything like Orthodox are pretty much forced to assume that they must therefore be secular instead. However, through the work that we here at Solel have been doing and the work that other liberal congregations all over the world have been doing to support progressive Judaism in Israel, hundreds of Reform congregations have been formed in the past several years, and thousands upon thousands of Israelis are starting to see that being progressive and being Jewish go hand in hand. What does this have to do with our Torah portion? Let's take a step back and recap what's there. Chayyei Sarah, the life of Sarah, consists of chapters 23, 24, and part of 25 of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. The portion begins with Sarah dying at the ripe old age of 127 and describes how Abraham negotiated with the Hittites to buy the cave of Machpelah as a burial site. That's chapter 23. In chapter 24, Abraham, getting on himself, decides that it's important to find his son Isaac a wife. So he sends his senior servant Eliezer to go find a suitable girl from amongst Abraham's relatives in Nahor. Eliezer asks God to give him a sign when he finds the right bride, and no sooner does he do so, but Rebekah appears and gives the sign Eliezer is looking for. Eliezer has a visit with Rebekah's family, and then they go back together to Abraham's home, where Rebekah and Isaac are happily married, and that's the part that you heard chanted this morning. To round out the portion in chapter 25, Abraham takes another wife, Keturah, has another 6 sons, and finally dies and is buried by Isaac and Ishmael in the same cave he bought back in chapter 23. So let me ask you this. When we read this portion each year, what ideas jump out at you? Any suggestions? Some of the things I think that we commonly think about in this portion are this is a proof text against intermarriage. We think it's a proof text about the importance of place and of the land. and the significance in our lives of our burial rituals and that kind of thing. But there's another idea that I think comes through very strongly, at least to me. And so let me ask you something else. How recent an innovation is the reform idea of egalitarianism in Jewish life? Does it go back to 1935, the year the first woman rabbi was ordained? Does it go back to 1873, the year that the Union for Reform Judaism, actually then the UAHC, was founded in Cincinnati? Well, let me tell you what I think. I think the reform idea of egalitarianism in Jewish life goes back a lot further than any of that. It goes back further than the daughters of Zelophehad and Moses wandering in the wilderness. It goes back all the way to Genesis chapter 24 and to the matriarch Rebekah. Now, some of you might be thinking, hang on there, everyone knows the Torah was written by men and that women hardly get a mention, let alone a fair shake. To which I'd have to say, absolutely, I hear that. But I'd also have to say that context is everything, and I think we should be giving God and our ancient ancestors a little bit more credit, and let me tell you why. Let's start with Abraham. We all think of Abraham as being a pretty upstanding guy. He's the first patriarch, the first Jew, the one with whom God made the covenant. He's the father of our faith, and not just ours. Abraham is pretty esteemed in other major religions too. Christians consider him the prototype of all believers, and Muslims call him the friend of God. When we think of Abraham, we think about someone who is a model of a lot of really important and admirable qualities. Abraham is faithful and obedient and eager, as is shown by his readiness to walk away from a comfortable, familiar life, pulling up stakes to go to an unknown land. He shows it again by his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, all at God's command. Abraham is also principled and hospitable. We see this in the way he argues with God on behalf of the innocent people that may be in Sodom and Gomorrah, and the way he treats strangers, who just happen to be angels, when they pass by his home. All in all, Abraham is a pretty good role model. So what does this have to do with reform egalitarianism? So now let's look at Rebekah. What does the Torah teach us about her? When we first meet Rebekah, it's by the town well in Haran. Abraham's servant Eliezer just rolled into town looking for a bride for Isaac. We know from the way Eliezer took the job from Abraham in the first place that he considers the whole enterprise to be kind of a long shot. After all, what kind of girl is going to want to leave her family and go someplace she's never been to marry some guy she's never met? When he gets to Haran, Eliezer prays to God, asking God to show Eliezer that he's found the right girl. Eliezer plans to ask a girl who's come to the well for a drink of water, and the sign is that if she gives him water, and then when he asks for it, and then she also offers to water his camels too, well then he'll know that she's the one. Rebekah did all of that, and with gusto, and she went one further by inviting Eliezer to come and stay overnight at her family's home. Eliezer told his story to Rebekah's family, and they agreed to let Rebekah go back with Eliezer to be Isaac's wife. But they wanted her to stay with them just a little while longer, 10 days, before leaving. Eliezer wanted to go right away, so the family left it to Rebekah to decide, and she didn't hesitate. She said, "Let's go." This is what we learn about Rebekah in chapter 24. She's extremely kind and hospitable, and what's more, she's eager and faithful, just like her great-uncle and future father-in-law, Abraham. Later in life, Rebekah had sons of her own, the pious and learned Jacob and the idolatrous Esau. Isaac was more partial to his firstborn, if brutish son, Esau, but Rebekah made sure that God's plan was followed by helping Jacob to secure Isaac's blessing instead of Esau, and then she sent Jacob off to Haran to find his own wife from Abraham's family. This shows us that Rebekah was faithful and principled, just like Abraham. Without Rebekah intervening like this, Isaac's blessing would have gone to Esau and his two Canaanite wives, who became the founders of the Edomite nation, one of the various bands of ne'er-do-wells who went on to make trouble for the Jews centuries later. In this way, Rebekah saved the Jewish people before even there were a Jewish people per se. There are way too many parallels between Abraham and Rebekah to treat them as a kind of coincidence. The Torah has a clear message for us here, and that message is that both men and women have an equally important role to play in living Jewishly and promoting and passing on Jewish values. The Torah is teaching us the importance of egalitarianism, and it's doing it 500 years before Moses. The importance of egalitarianism is obvious to us as Reformed Jews. Although we sometimes like to think of this as being a modern idea, it's actually always been there as a part of God's plan for us. It's not just a core Reformed Jewish value, it's a core Jewish value, period. Anybody who tries to tell you differently just isn't reading the Torah very carefully. I often like to say that God is a liberal. That, to me, is the undeniable message of Torah. As Reformed Jews, we're in the forefront of promoting God's progressive message of peace, of pluralism, of social action, and yes, of egalitarianism. So, just as Rabbi Pollack said to us in the Torah study class a couple of weeks ago, we shouldn't be measuring ourselves against someone else's understanding of how to live Jewishly. We have a very strong understanding of our own, and we get it straight out of Torah. Shabbat Shalom.